Okay, hello. Today I'm going to be reading this book, chapter 11 and 12 from The Humble Little Condom. Okay. 11. Nookie. In the struggle, buggy. All that jazz in the age of advertising. After the sexually confused Victorian era and the devastating war were over, it was time to live again. Many young people took advantage of the rapidly changing social norms to break with old conventions. Provocative terms like spooning, petting, it girl, vamps, flappers, and gaiety girls became part of contemporary language. Young women rebelled against old-fashioned mores by raising their hem lengths, cutting their hair into bobs, and picking up men, reflecting on the changes in courting in the United States. In 1927, Emily Post's book of etiquette talked about the vanishing chaperone, or as young men called it, fire extinguishers. Young couples were no longer accompanied on their dates. Yet another new love word. Yet another new love word. Dates. In the United Kingdom, the bright young things were slammed by the conservative press, but enjoyed a sexual freedom. First experienced by those who had served as nurses and ambulance drivers during World War I, unbeknownst to their mothers and grandmothers, the term the jazz age became a synonym for sex. For Americans, the 1920s was the first era in which most people lived in cities, a complete reversal from just a few decades before when the majority still lived on farms. Life expectancy for the country's population of 106 million was the highest in history. Men could expect to live to 53 and women 54, 10 years more than the previous generation. The military had only 343,000 men, down from well over a million in 1919. The average man made a whopping $1,236 a year, and illiteracy was at its lowest level ever. 94% of Americans could read and write. Wall Street came into its own, and Madison Avenue was born. And the prohibition against producing and drinking alcohol, combined with rampant corruption in many police departments, made the 20s an era when gangland crime and mob warfare went unchecked. For the English, things were not quite so rosy, as industry never recovered from the effects of war, and the labor movement had really begun in earnest, putting added pressures on the economy and on the country's social structure. For all that, however, the children of the aristocracy and the middle classes were having a jolly good time, sipping cocktails, speaking dribble, and generally enjoying doing little of consequence. The Model T and no more fire extinguishers. According to a report by American sociologists, a new profession that arose out of progressivism, Robert and Helen Lind, by the early 20s, young people were in a world of their own, no longer bound by the mores and morals of their parents and grandparents. The Linds study showed that 50% of young adults living in urban areas identified themselves as sexually active. This was due to the general loosening of morals and the car. In the United States, Henry Ford's mass produced automobiles made it possible for even working class Americans to afford to buy one. But Ford's little black car was dubbed a house of prostitution on wheels by worried mothers and fathers, and admonitions not to park were heard across America. Worries or not, nookie in the struggle boogie, the sex in the back seat of the car was here to stay. Red tips for hot lips. Modern marketing techniques became the key to good sales in the 1920s, although condom sales had been incredible during the war. By 1920, Europeans were manufacturing their own again, and American manufacturers floundered in the first few years of the new decade. Looking for ways to beef up the market, they borrowed new marketing ideas being used to sell other products. Catchy names and slick packaging were especially important for the condom industry because prophylactics could only be labeled and sold legally as disease preventatives, influenced by the way cigarettes, now pre-made instead of hand-rolled, handsomely packaged and designed with colored paper ends inspired by the British brand Red Tips, were being marketed. Condom manufacturers began to package their wares in slick little cigarette cases, three to a package, subtle and perfectly sized for a man's pocket. Easy access was important when the petting party went all the way. Packaging helped the producers work around legal restrictions on how their products were labeled. They made their brand names stand out and the images on the packages sexy. Although benign and downright dull, terms like liquid latex or liquid latex prophylactic rubbers were used to describe the contents of the package. The brand names often reflected gently erotic themes. Julia Schmidt's Sheiks exploited the popularity of Rudolph Valentino, who was referred to as the Sheik, a 20s euphemism for the sinuous man. Schmidt also produced the Ramses brand with its picture of an Egyptian king on the front, inferring that the man who wore one was as sexually powerful as an Egyptian pharaoh. His others were not quite as colorful, but still had suggestive names like Forex, Paradise, and the Lido. Other brands like Parisians were identifying themselves with the new post-war language that found all things French risque, and it was not a far leap from the still common French letters. The Merry Widows were more popular for their unique packaging and message than for their quality. The widows came in a little round gold can with three condoms tucked neatly in their waxy little wrappings, each with its own name: Agnes, Mabel, and Becky. The sophisticated marketing implied that sexually savvy women loved this brand best. For their purely sensual message, however, mermaids had to win the prize. This condom package was labeled Perfection Made and was decorated with a very seductive sea maiden, leaning back in an erotic pose, lounging topless on a rock. Hardly subtle, but very effective. Britons continued to enjoy the only British made protection, the Durex, but most of theirs were unremarkably packaged preservatives, imported once again from Germany. There were other packaging innovations in the 20s, but they were of a more practical nature. In the 1920s, DuPont engineers developed a new material they called cellophane, and some of the top condom manufacturers used it to improve the shelf life of their product. Better yet, A new and improved Trojan made from a revolutionary rubber product called latex made its debut in 1920. Condom sales skyrocketed in the Jazz Age. Condom sales skyrocketed in the Jazz Age. Latex and dreadnoughts. In the 1910s, Julius Schmidt had introduced the first major rubber innovation since Goodyear had figured out the vulcanization process. He pioneered the cement dipping method. Dipping required the same glass molds that had been used by the more refined gut makers for centuries, but they were now dunked in large vats of a liquid rubber solution rather than wrapped with strips of pre-made rubber or gutta percha. As revolutionary as the process was, however, Schmidt's new technique had some unfortunate side effects. Because gasoline or benzene had to be added to the imported sap to make it truly liquid. The problem with cement dipping was that the improved rubber product was highly inflammable in its liquid state. Since there was always the threat of fire from a variety of sources at the production plants, even the spark from a piece of electrical equipment could ignite a vat of rubber. The big players, all of whom had had to contend with fires and the ensuing loss of revenue and equipment, began to take out insurance on their factories. Because of the high risk, the premiums were steep, but for the larger manufacturers, it was cheaper than the cost of a fire. And then along came latex. Latex helped cut the cost of insurance by eliminating the flammability problem. It required only water to suspend the liquid sap and simplified the production process. The penis molds were dipped into the latex and then cured in warm water. No more rubbing, trimming, but most important, no more chemicals. The final product looked nicer, could be stored for up to 5 years. The old rubbers, in spite of what the advertisers claimed, had a shelf life of only 3 months and was stronger yet a lot thinner, making it much more sensitive. Oddly, latex represents yet another of the funny little coincidences in the life of the humble little condom. Throughout the 1920s, some of the finest scientists in the United States worked on the latex project, hoping to help medicine by making much improved surgical gloves, but inadvertently improved another little device and earned it a place in the history of serious science. Although by the beginning of the 20s, Americans were buying millions of latex condoms per day, the more refined latex American leather did not arrive on European shores until the end of the decade. The first latex sheath to appear on the English market in 1929 was an export manufactured by the U.S. Young's Rubber Corporation. Although it was essentially a Trojan, the British labeled it under the not very subtle name Dreadnought instead. By 1932, the London Rubber Company, which had previously been a wholesale business importing German preservatives, began to produce its own latex rubbers in competition with the American market. Automated prophylactics throughout the 20s, latex and cement dipped condoms were still handmade. Throughout the 20s, latex and cement dipped condoms were still handmade, requiring the big producers to employ a lot of semi skilled workers. But with the advancement of the assembly line, the brainchild of a new breed called the engineer, and embraced by industrialists like Ford, even the condom industry went high tech. The first real condom assembly line involved a series of hands on activities, including the specialized job of rolling the open end of each rubber in order to have a smooth finished edge. But that cumbersome chore was eliminated when, in 1926, Fred Killian of Akron, Ohio, invented and patented the first automatic condom ring machine. Killian's new invention ended the need for workers to perform the rolling function and sped up the process considerably. By 1930, Killian, manufacturer of the Permatex and Silvertex condom brands, had improved upon his design and produced a complete assembly line, originally intended only for his own plant. The new system required almost no hands-on involvement during the production process. Although there are no surviving photographs of the line, the patent describes an amazing conveyor belt that automatically dipped 4,000 glass forms or bottles into ivory-colored latex, one dip per second. The mold holders were designed to move back and forth from side to side in order to prevent the tip of the condom from forming a nipple shape or unattractive lumps and bumps that would make them less than aesthetic. Cylinder-shaped brushes roll the top of the condom to finish the open edge, and then blasts of hot air and a dip in hot water vulcanized, finished off, and sealed it. An assembly line attendant sprinkled talcum powder on every one of the finished products, which helped dry the rubber and make them smooth. And then they were removed by another set of brushes that scraped each. An assembly line attendant sprinkled talcum powder on every one of the finished products, which helped dry the rubber and make them smooth. And then they were removed by another set of brushes that scraped each off of its original mold. The roughly rolled product was conveyed down to the only people who actually touched them until after being sold. Women workers stretched out each condom they tended to bunch up when removed from the mold, making sure each was straight because newly formed latex tended to glue together if it was not straightened out right after processing. Then the molds went through a cleansing hot water bath to remove any contaminants before beginning the whole process again. This new 24-hour-a-day production method meant a much better product at a much lower production price, and thousands of condoms a day could be produced without fear of fire or human error. Killian's invention was successful. After patenting it, he went public and charged a whopping $20,000, as much as $2 million today, per conveyor system. Sales were limited, but the big boys snapped them up. Others took advantage of Killian's leasing program, the terms of which included that the lessee had to pay Fred Killian a percentage of the total sales resulting from production. The high cost of purchase meant that in just one decade, none of the remaining small condom manufacturers could hold their own in the marketplace, making this one small entrepreneur friendly business one of the top moneymakers in American industry. Men like Schmidt and Youngs found themselves squarely in the middle of Wall Street, two of only 15 major manufacturers left by 1925. The coin-operated condom. The Germans were back in production by the early 20s, once again dominating the European condom market and kicking the American condom back across the Atlantic. One German manufacturer sold more than 24 million a year throughout the decade. They had also, along with the Dutch, pioneered the slot or vending machine in the late 1910s. By the 1920s, condom vending machines were all over the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands, and England. The highly public sales venue and the easy consumer access was symbolic of the incredible impact industrialization had had on Western nations and how universally accepted the condom had become. Caveat emptor. Condom magnate Julius Schmidt, the man who had arrived on American shores with only the shirt on his back, sold 20 million latex condoms in 1 year alone in the 1920s, making him second only to Young's in production. But just because letters had gone high tech, high profile, and big business, it did not mean that all was well in condom land, at least not ethically speaking. Although the tremendous boom in manufacturing improvements meant better condoms, the testing process was still necessary to assure safety and effectiveness. To be sure of their products and to be able to guarantee consistent quality, manufacturers like Schmidt employed dozens of women whose sole job it was to check each rubber for holes, dirt, and other contaminants. The process added to the production and sales price, but made his brands very popular with choosy consumers. In spite of this quality testing, though, in the big, bad world of condom commerce, it was still buyer beware. The first generation of Trojans went into production in 1916, but after the war, Young's, who had started out in the business under the name Young's and Fay, had struggled because of the drop in exports to Europe. The new Trojans had put U.S. Young's Rubber Corporation back on the map because of their comfort and reliability. Latex and testing made that possible. The problem was the rejects. Once a Trojan had been found to be defective, it was discarded into a cardboard box underneath the quality control conveyor belts. But contrary to ethical business practice, these defectives were not thrown away at the end of the day. Instead, they were quietly sealed up and put in the warehouse and surreptitiously sold later as seconds to less than reputable jobbers who were always able to find outlets for really cheap rubbers. Barbershops, gas stations, shoeshine boys, and bartenders at speakeasies all bought and sold them. As big a player in the business as Young's was, he even had a Standard and Poor's rating. He was too cheap. And to be fair, he had struggled to keep his business afloat after the war, to throw away the rejects, and he made a tidy profit from selling his defects to wholesalers. Young's accountants called his seconds different grades in their account books, but this side business actually added a healthy addition to his bottom line. Although he himself never suffered any negative consequences for his dishonesty, Young's lack of ethics did have its price. What's in a name? Manufacturers moved beyond just trendy packaging when they again took their cue from other industries and began to apply for trademarks for their products. They also moved away from the small, surreptitious advertisements of the old days, taking out whole page ads in major papers around the country, selling their condoms as disease preventers. It was Merle Youngs who took marketing well beyond vending machines, packaging, and newspapers, though. He decided that he could capture a serious market share for his best products, selling them through only one venue. His reasoning was that since his products could only be labeled as disease preventatives, it made sense to sell his Trojans through pharmacies. After all, pharmacists were trusted corner retailers who were always dispensing advice about their products. Young saw the chance to take advantage of a free sales force. He sold pharmacists on the idea by emphasizing the fact that Trojans were the most reliable on the market. By pushing them over other brands, the pharmacists were differentiating themselves as true professionals who offered only the finest disease protection. The high price they fetched did not hurt their feelings either. Publicly, he couched this sales strategy not as a money making scheme, but as one based on Young's deeply held belief that he must protect his customers from harm. He wanted American men to feel safe when they used his brand. But the reality was that by narrowing his outlets to pharmacists only, Young's could sell Trojans at a premium price. He was capitalizing on the fact that many people work off the premise that the more expensive a product is, the better quality it must be. Young's Trojans brand sold for $1.50 a dozen, at least $15 today, adjusting for inflation, while the lesser brands like Merry Widows cost less than a third of that. The lesser prophylactics were sold at a variety of outlets, but they did not have the snob appeal Trojans had cultivated throughout the 20s. Pharmacists were an important part of the success of Trojans brand, and Young's got his wish. Pharmacies set a high profit margin for the premium product, which paid the rent for pharmacists across the country, and Young's got his free sales force. The two distinct marketing techniques Young's employed worked in tandem by pushing his Trojans through a health retailer and by supplying imperfect prophylactics to jobbers who sold them to anyone who was buying. He exploited both ends of the market. Experience with bad condoms might have left some men and women figuring that higher priced sheaths were worth the cost. He also conveniently blamed his competitors, some who sold off their seconds and others who never bothered to test their products, for any bad image problems, never admitting to his own contribution to that poor reputation. The producer of Trojans also inadvertently helped to make the big manufacturers even bigger. When a former customer who had purchased resale seconds from Young's was angered after being told that Young's would no longer sell to him, possibly due to a personal argument between the two, the angry jobber decided to get back at Young's by borrowing the Trojan label, stamping it on rejects he purchased from another manufacturer, and selling his goods as the genuine article. Reminiscent of the battling Mrs. P's of 18th century England, an advertising war ensued, and Young's, who had received a trademark patent for Trojans a few years before, sued the jobber for trademark infringement, claiming he had the exclusive right to use the Trojans label. The Trojan War had begun. One second. The more things change, the more they stay the same. It was a test case, since condoms had pretty much been confined to criminal court cases involving activists like Margaret Sanger and the small time dealers of the 19th century who were unlucky enough to get caught by Anthony Comstock. The first judge to hear Young's trademark infringement. The first judge to hear Young's trademark infringement case was someone out of the bad old days of condom controversy. He flatly stated that it was not a legitimate legal case and dismissed it, claiming that the suit was contrary to public morals and an aid to and an encourager of lewdness and lechery, thereby sufficiently reprehensible to outside the field of equitable protection. But Young's was a tough cookie and a survivor of years of this kind of legal prejudice. He took the case back to court in 1930, and a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit saw it differently, reflecting the changing face of American society and at the same time harking back to the hypocrisy that is the history of the condom. The U.S. Court of Appeal sided with Young, stating that Trojans was a legal trademark for a legitimate disease preventative. Happy news for Young's and his sales force. Now, all the big manufacturers could rest easy about spending large amounts on advertising their wares without fear of trademark infringement or shaky legal standing of their products because they were contrary to public morals. But the judges view that Mr. Young's decision to market only through legitimate pharmacists, keeping prophylactics in a medicinal light rather than as a dirty little sex aid, just perpetuated the lie and illustrated the same old logic that has dogged the condom for centuries. The judge made it clear that condoms sold through a pharmacy were a promoter of health, while the lesser brands, especially those produced by smaller markers, let me read this again. But the judge but the judge's view that Mr. Young's decision to market only through legitimate pharmacists, keeping prophylactics in a medicinal light rather than as a dirty little sex aid, just perpetuated the lie and illustrated the same old illogic that has dogged the condom for centuries. The judge made it clear that condoms sold through a pharmacy were a promoter of health, while the lesser brands, especially those produced by smaller makers and not marketed through pharmacies, were obviously used during illicit sexual encounters because they were being sold through illegitimate, non medical outlets. Unperturbed by legal hypocrisy and as brand name recognition became more and more important to their sales, by 1930 the big manufacturers had all applied for patents. Just a few years before, men had bought rubbers, sheaths, or letters. Now they had to decide between Trojans, Ramses, sheiks, and mermaids. Two and sixpence and a blob of sealing wax. There were no British court cases fought over condom trademarks, nor were manufacturers restricted to selling their prophylactics only as disease preventatives. Durexes and dreadnoughts were only were openly advertised as birth control. This enlightened approach to regulation and marketing make it all the more curious than that, though the British had embraced, before Americans, a more open policy about the use and sales of sheaths when it came to condom sales. Many British chemists behave as if they were selling, reluctantly, government secrets instead of rubbers. Recollecting his experiences as an apprentice in the 1920s, a British chemist laughed as he described the awkwardness of customers because of the disapproval of his fellow chemists when there was a request for a package. The awkwardness arose from the ritual involved in supplying them. A customer who did not already know firsthand the embarrassment of finding out if the shop sold them. When a solitary man came in, asked loudly for a tube of toothpaste, and then lingeringly anxiously while the girl assistants discreetly disappeared, you knew what he really wanted. The matter did not end there when, at last, he eventually found the courage to lean over the counter and whisper his requirements still had to be met. The articles were kept no less securely than the dangerous drugs. The articles were kept no less securely than the dangerous drugs. Locked in the safe next to the cash box, the junior apprentice was not really supposed to know, so the forbidden word was passed quietly along the line to one of the pharmacists. Then, with eyes averted and sometimes a slight reddening of the cheeks, he would grope blindly on the top shelf of the safe, hastily wrap something in a plain white paper, aptly a blob of sealing wax, and hand it to the customer himself, saying, "Take two and sixpence, Charles." It was all very awkward. Another young apprentice also described his experiences selling French letters as a very hush hush affair. Oh, very well, under the counter. Only the pharmacist sold them. I wasn't allowed to sell them. In fact, I was not shown where the Durex was kept. They were in a drawer. I discovered that because I could go anywhere I liked, but I discovered those on my own. That was rather like the whole conception of birth and everything between parents and their children. You sort of grew into the knowledge, and my apprentice master very much followed that. And no one sold Durex to the customers except the pharmacists. The customers would come in and say, "May I see Mr. Elder, please?" or "May I see the pharmacist?" Of course, every member of the staff knew exactly what they wanted, but that was the attitude very much under the counter. This odd prejudice was so pervasive that the United Kingdom's largest and most famous, and still in business today, pharmacy chain, Boots, decided in the 20s to adopt a policy against selling condoms, claiming the new rule was to protect its staff from having to deal with any awkwardness. The Boots staff, on the other hand, was not quite so positive about this odd policy. A longtime employee recalled her experiences as a clerk. Boots only sold contraceptive pessaries. There were not many requests for the sheath. Most people seemed to know that Boots didn't sell them, but occasionally we would get requests. They would come in and say, "Pack of Durex, please." You would say, "Sorry, we don't sell them." And then they would ask, "Why don't you sell them?" And we would say that the company doesn't allow us to sell them. Why was that then? Because they feel it's embarrassing for the staff. Well, it's darn sight more embarrassing for the staff when I come in here and ask for them, and they have to explain to me why they can't sell them. And that was the sort of reaction you would get. So it was a lot more embarrassing for the staff. At least if you had them, you could slip them into a bag and pass them over the counter. It was a lot less fuss than trying to explain why you couldn't sell them in the first place. Boots did not reverse that policy until the 1960s, and it was not until well after World War II that the leading agency that had been influential in convincing some independent pharmacies not to sell sheaths began to reverse its anti condom stance. The English Pharmaceutical Society began by telling its members there could be no exhibition of contraceptive in a pharmacy or any reference by way of advertisement, notice, a show card, or otherwise that they are sold here, other than a notice approved by the council bearing the word family planning requisites. All very droll. Unperturbed by this silliness, throughout the teens and 20s, most Englishmen ordered out of catalogs or went to specialty stores, a vending machine, the barber, or a rubber goods store for their little something for the weekend. The prophylactic popularity. Throughout the 20s, condom sales in countries around the world doubled. In the United States, the condom business had joined the rest of the big boys on Wall Street. Its advanced production techniques, assembly lines, legal backing, and a booming market influenced by the continued lightening up of sexual mores or all contributed to making condom production an incredibly profitable industry. And like all trends, its public acceptance meant that it even showed up in popular fiction. In his best selling book, Manhattan Transfer, John Dos Passos documented another common 20s euphemism for the condom by having one of his leading characters worried about his profile. In spite of the public acceptance of the Profo and its availability through legitimate retail, many American men, like their British counterparts, still bought their supplies from street salesmen, barbers, bartenders at the gas station, corner delicatessen, candy store, from shoeshine boys, tobacconists, restaurant wait staff, baggers at the grocers, bellhops, and even the tailor. Those still living in the more rural areas could order their supplies through the mail from catalogs. Sears and Roebuck sold a variety of sheaths, along with other devices that were obviously intended for birth control. It seemed everyone was in on the condom action, taking advantage of the fact that Americans were more sexually active than ever before. The Freudian slip, the pros and cons. Although he had written about his dislike of the condom as early as 1895, By the 1920s, Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud was more vociferous in his comments about the little device. He maintained that the sheath cut down on sexual pleasure and that it hurt the fine susceptibilities of both partners. He was critical of all types of birth control, claiming he was concerned that no method was foolproof, but he reserved his greatest contempt for the condom. Freudian scholars postulate that his extreme dislike of the sheath was because of its disruptive quality, and most probably his love hate relationship with sex all the way around. Or other high visibility jazz age opponents of the condom included a well known woman doctor, Dorothy Bacher. Bacher, worried Bacher worked in Margaret Sanger's New York birth control clinic in the early 20s, where she came to dislike the condom on the same grounds earlier birth control advocates had stated. It took control away from the woman. It was not regulated by doctors. Breakage could be a problem, and it was awkward to use, possibly discouraging regular use. In Great Britain, there was some debate over whether condom use could be considered moral. In the Church of England's 1920 Lambeth Conference condemned, the Church of England's 1920 Lambeth Conference condemned the use of unnatural means of conception avoidance. It warned against the physical, moral, and religious dangers of using any kind of contraceptive. The Bishop of London, a prominent member of numerous public morality councils, who was deemed by one of his detractors a still single fuss budget, tried to stop all pharmacists from selling condoms without success. Bishop Arthur Winnington-Ingram fought against anything he felt added to the seedier side of London life, but he had an especially virulent dislike of condoms, constantly complaining about the huge number of them discarded in the alleys and parks all over the city. The problem was most acute after weekends and holidays when legions of dustmen were sent out to collect and dispose of them. Railing against the used sheath, the bishop said, I would like to make a bonfire of them and dance around it." Mm, talk about Freudian. The British medical journal, The Lancet, also showed disdain for the condom, dismissing it as a distasteful subject, impotent to deal with any certainty with the virile spermatozoon. Others in the medical field warned of the horror a young wife would experience if she were exposed to something as shocking as her new husband donning his letter. And the old chestnut about using a condom was tantamount to masturbation, or masturbation à deux, had not gone away either. Other detractors did not care about the rights and wrongs of its use. They simply demanded the closure of rubber shops because they represented a moral danger on visual grounds. Ignore the obscuranists. Arguments for condom use during the 1920s far outweighed the arguments against it when author H.G. Wells, who when author H.G. Wells, who sat on the board of the National Birth Control Council with Mary Stopes, heard people argue against birth control, he informed them that all Britons had the right and need to be informed about sex, contraception, and the devices necessary to protect themselves. Wells argued that birth control protected women. I think that a married woman who knows nothing about birth control is little better than a serf, a mere helpless breeding animal. And when I find a obscurantist, a Roman Catholic, sitting in the light at the Ministry of Health, I think myself entitled to make a noise about it. Wells was joined by the more liberal Church of England clergymen who outnumbered the conservatives, calling for a more definitive a more definite statement as to how Christian men and women may live their married lives in harmony with church principles and Bible teaching, and yet not bring into the world children for whom they can see no prospect of making reasonable provision. The Bishop of Birmingham was more blunt about it. We must have a recognition of the legitimacy of birth control. The old Malthusian concerns over birth rate among the poor also remained a concern, for some educated laymen and doctors alike spoke out for sex education for the poor as an important health measure and called for sheath use to prevent too many pregnancies. Elsewhere in Europe, pro and con debates raged, especially in France, concerned about the depopulation caused by the terrible death toll of World War One. French conservatives called on their fellow parliamentarians to make birth control illegal because of the most urgent need to increase French natality, indicative of how the pendulum had swung in that nation. The few who argued that such a draconian act would simply lead to underground black marketing of devices were booed. When communist Andre Berthon asked, "Are you going to condemn pharmacists to sell, let's speak plainly, condoms?" He barely made it out of the chamber without bodily injury. The sole pro condom voice in the Republican Party was a gynecologist and member of the Extra Parliamentary Commission on Depopulation. His objection to turning around centuries old acceptance and use of a variety of birth control and disease preventative measures was based on his medical experiences. He was convinced that women who did not have access to implements would end up using pen holders to solve the problem of unwanted pregnancies, a precautionary note for the decades to come. Virile Protectors. The loosening of sexual mores in the Jazz Age is actually credited with helping to contribute to a drop in the number of prostitutes and brothels in the United States and Europe, which paralleled a drop in the number of venereal diseases reported throughout the 20s. In spite of the statistics, which they may or may not have been aware of, military leaders were still concerned about sexually transmitted diseases and the threat they posed for sailors and soldiers. The British and the other European militaries continued to supply their members with prophylactics. Even the ultra conservative, anti birth control, future fascist leader of Spain, General Francisco Franco, required his army cadets be supplied with German made condoms. When they went out at night, he did spot checks as the young men left for an evening of enjoyment, and was known to extract severe punishments if anyone was caught not carrying at least one letter. But it was not until 1927 that the American Army and Navy finally saw the light in regard to prevention rather than cure. Senior medical officers promoted the use of educational programs along with making protectors easily available. In order to gain acceptance for making condoms a part of any sailor's or soldier's kit, the military turned the old abstinence and purity campaign around and made virility the center of their argument. An army or navy made up of emasculated men with no sex drive was unthinkable. The boys will be boys approach worked, helped by the general lessening of old traditions and prudish Victorian sexual taboos. Prophylactics were easily found at any military site around the world and were standard issue to all American military members by 1931. The lessons from the Great War had finally been learned. Brother, can you spare a dime for a rubber? The Great Depression, Chapter 12. When the American stock market crashed and burned in 1929, the halcyon days of the jazz age were over, and the light-hearted belief that the good times would never end were replaced with the worst economic depression in history. Millions of American men were out of work, with many of the unemployed living the hobo's life or packing everything they could into the old Model T to search for a better place. Although few Americans were spared the pain, there were some bright spots in an otherwise bleak time. In 1930, to the delight of many little girls, Nancy Drew began to solve her mysteries. The Better Homes and Gardens cookbook went on sale one day to join the short list of the best-selling books in history. Games like Monopoly were created to help while away long hours at home. Castle Burgers was the first fast food chain serving an affordable little 5-cent burger, and 2 out of every 5 homes in America had a radio, ushering in the golden age of broadcasts, with celebrities like Bing Crosby, Guy Lombardo, and Rudy Vallee dominating the airwaves, because few could afford to enjoy the more lavish entertainment so popular in the 20s. Depression era Hollywood, helped by the arrival of color film, prospered. Millions of Americans scraped up a quarter every week to sit in a theater and lose themselves in the films of Clark Gable, Judy Garland, and Katharine Hepburn. And there was no Black Friday for the condom. There were a number of factors that helped the Depression era condom business flourish, some legal, most financial. Although the law was always behind the times, several U.S. federal courts of appeals cases finally repealed the last of the federal Comstock leftovers. For the first time, doctors were free to prescribe preventatives for any reason they deemed fit. Although very few men or women consulted doctors when it came to contraception, the decision prompted the old fashioned American Medical Association to finally withdraw its objections to the condom as birth control. This paved the way in 1938 for more than 300 legal birth control clinics to open across the country, supplying poor women with condoms, diaphragms, and general medical help and advice. Longtime followers of Margaret Sanger were at once disgusted that it had taken so many years for it to happen, and delighted that finally poor women had free and legal birth control options. And even more important legal decision an even more important legal decision assisted the industry in a big way. A federal court ended the Comstock era ban on the advertising of birth control information, making it legal to advertise a ship prophylactics, making it easier. Let me read that again. An even more important legal decision assisted the industry in a big way. A federal court ended the Comstock era ban on the advertising of birth control information, making it making it legal to advertise and ship prophylactics. Although mail order catalogs had been doing a land office business for years, Although mail order catalogs had been doing a land office business for years, this made it much easier for the well respected catalogs like Sears and Roebuck to now boldly market their brands, which not only made the products more visible, but also helped to continue educating the public about condom use. Also, at the federal level, in spite of cuts in budgets that meant less money to supply troops with their kids, the American Army and Navy continued with their policy of quietly adding pros to the standard provisions given to soldiers and sailors. Although military leaders claimed this was just a continuation of the 1918 decision to provide prophylactics for disease protection, since that time the Navy had actually handed out printed materials informing its men that their kits were also handy for birth control. Married military men used as many pros as unmarried. When he ran out of the freebies and had to buy his own, the average military member was paying 10 cents, roughly $1 today, for a box of three at his local exchange. A study from the early 30s conducted by the Surgeon General on the purchase of condoms at army bases indicated that even when soldiers had to pay for their own, they did so willingly, buying an average of 10 per soldier per year. The provision of the kits, along with easy access on base, coincided with a steep decline in venereal diseases reported by the military. Although dropping the legal barriers to advertising condoms as birth control and the continued push for their use by the military certainly helped support the booming industry, the real reason for the amazing sales during the Depression was that fewer and fewer Americans felt they could afford to have children. No matter how broke couples were, they could find a few cents to prevent pregnancies. Condoms were cheaper than children. The need to have fewer or no children conflicted with the fact that with such high unemployment, adults had a lot more time on their hands. During the sexy 20s, the taboo that made having sex during the day a no-no had dropped. There were plenty of people using their little devices for afternoon delights. Because of the social and financial pressures so many people were under, fewer and fewer couples felt they could even afford to marry, and the marriage rate dropped like a stone. By 1935, there were fewer marriages being performed than at any other time in American history, which meant an even greater need to prevent unwanted pregnancies. It is perhaps a cruel irony that, in a time of such financial ruin, during every year of the Depression, people spent more than $33 million on condoms. Bust and boom. During the Depression, American manufacturers churned out more than 1.5 million condoms a day. The word condom, however, remained something men muttered only among themselves, most preferring the popular euphemisms of the day: safety, rubber, overcoat, raincoat, French cat, French letter, nodder, protection, pro, rubber, Johnny, profo. Women favored just widow. Like their American counterparts, European manufacturers continued to enjoy great sales, and both American and British men bought their supplies from the same sources as before: coin-operated machines, local barbershops, and petrol stations. In spite of the worldwide impact of the crash, European and English condom producers did very well for themselves. In 1932, the London Rubber Company, which had only been a wholesaler for German sheaths prior to this time, began to produce its own latex knotters, a British euphemism. The company became Britain's largest manufacturer, producing about 2 million per year. Not quite Fuller Brush, but the unique marketplace, along with the creativity that is often the result of desperation, may help explain the rise of a new kind of entrepreneur, the prophylactic door-to-door salesman. Taking their cue from generations of peddlers, a profession that was revived in the Jazz Age with the creation of the Fuller Brush Man, this sales force was made up of men who traveled as far as necessary to sell their not very good rubber goods. Many women across America had the unusual experience of opening their doors to be greeted with a cheery, "Good morning, madam. Have you a moment to view my excellent preventatives?" Although the peddlers did not make a lot of money or challenge the profits of the retail sales outlets, these independents did have their own small market share, apparently acceptable in the topsy turvy world of the Great Depression. Even though sales venues altered little, with the exception of door to door sales, the industry itself went through major changes in the 30s, leaving behind most of its ancient roots and solidifying its new role as a big player in the world of commerce. At the same time, Casanova's old complaint had not gone away: the numbers game. The high startup costs, especially the invention of Killian's condom conveyor in 1930, meant that by the mid 30s, only a handful of major manufacturers remained in the market, a continuation of the consolidation that had begun in the 1920s. Young's Rubber Market, Julius Schmidt Incorporated, Lewis Schunk, and the Dean Rubber Manufacturing Company were the biggest players, followed by lesser but profitable companies like Atlanta's Olympia Laboratory. Young's now famous Latex Trojans brand was one of the most popular because of its reliability, but it was too expensive for many. Ever savvy when it came to understanding the market niche for his sheath, Schmidt had stuck with the old cement rubber technique. Although it meant his factories had a greater incidence of fire, Julius felt it was worth the risk by using the old method of reproduction. He could legitimately label his rubbers as longer lasting, reusable, and they did stand up to the kinds of lubricants, animal fats, and Vaseline, still used after more than 50 years. Choosy consumers had long since abandoned this practice, but during the Depression, low price and reusability were appealing for those who needed to economize. Production figures differ from company to company, but the general cost of doing business breaks down to approximately $2.20 per gross. The rubber and the chemicals accounted for about 20 cents per gross. 40 cents went to overhead, $1.30 to the sales force, and anywhere from nothing to 25 cents per gross was spent on testing. Everything else was for miscellaneous procedures, depending on the quality and manufacturing process. The excessively high marketing cost versus a relatively low cost of production was driven by the fact that the condom market was no longer a mostly urban one. Americans everywhere wanted them, and that meant a widespread sales force and higher shipping costs. Bulk condoms could be purchased by distributors, some for as little as 50 cents and gross. They were the generics package under a variety of names, most lost to history. Others went for anywhere from $1.50 to almost $11 per gross. The higher end condoms were produced by the top three manufacturers and sold under their labels. Those sold at gas stations and from vending machines, barbershops, bartenders, corner food shops, pool halls, and bellhops were of poor quality and went for as little as 75 cents. But that was still a high profit considering the barber would have paid only $6 for a gross. In spite of the lower quality, men found it more convenient to get their pros when they bought gas, a paper, or a penny bag of sweets. In all, non medical suppliers sold about 1.5 million gross a year at an average price of $10 per gross for a total of almost $14 million a year. Adjusting for inflation, that's about $140 million in 21st century dollars. The only place sales figures dropped was at the druggist, where sales accounted for only one third of all condom sales. They charged an average of $16 per gross, which adds up to $11 million a year. This placed their goods way out of the reach for the average consumer. Besides the higher prices, druggists probably did themselves no favors, remaining the snobs of condom sales and stayed away from open display of the little item. Many also forced their clients to ask for their rubbers by name, still insisting on the behind the counter brown paper sack method. Still, even though price and availability had a negative impact on the druggist's sales, their profits remained sufficient to pay the rent for many pharmacies. Total condom profits equaled well over $33 million a year. This does not even account for the more than 200,000 gross sold to overseas markets. Foreign made condoms were not allowed legally into the United States until the 1950s, but American made condoms were exported to other countries. No wonder that, though, the top three continued to dominate with about 70% of the market share, a handful of smaller manufacturers still vied for a piece of it. In fact, perhaps driven by the fact that there were so few lucrative industries at the time, condom competition was cutthroat, which explains why emphasis was on mass production, not quality control. Flips and Wrinkles, the testing conundrum. Casanova would have been proud to know that his inventive ways of assaying his rendirote anglaise had stood the test of time. By the 1930s, there were actually four official methods of mechanical and semi mechanical testing used in the United States, and one in Great Britain and Germany. In spite of this, though, things had not changed much since the world's greatest lover had entertained his ladies with condom balloons. An American flip test was a labor intensive hands on method. A woman flipper who may not have loved her work or shared what she did with family and friends, but was grateful for any kind of employment, sat at a large table with a huge pile of condoms to her left. With her right hand, she hooked one at a time over a pipe connected to a primitive compressor that let out a steady stream of air. When the condom was half full of air, the flipper clamped down in the middle of it and looked for holes or stubborn wrinkles caused by the latex sticking during the vulcanization process. The flip test was the favorite method of most of the manufacturers who bothered to test at all, mainly because it was cheap and there were millions of women willing to do any kind of work for very low pay. It was the Depression, plus the ladies were guaranteed a free supply of widows. Faulty condoms were supposed to be discarded, but this eyes only method did not eliminate the majority of flawed products making it to market, and most of the major manufacturers who routinely tested had adopted Merrill Young's method of disposal. Sell them to the other guy. The other techniques used were not much better or terribly different from flipping. There was the hip test, where an assembly liner tested. The other techniques used were not much better or terribly different from flipping. There was the hip test, where an assembly line tester filled her condoms with air, allowed a sampling to get very large, and then pressed a large condom against her hip or her stomach to test for pressure. Sometimes she looked at the balloon for flaws, sometimes not. The cheek tests followed the same basic procedure, but the checker held the balloon up to her cheek to feel for air coming through. Cheek 2 was the same, but the operator also looked for dirt and other flaws and was supposed to inflate the samples 2 times each. More attention to detail. Cheek 2 was considered the most thorough method and was favored by manufacturers of the best brands. The English and Germans were far more methodical in their testing. Workers, more men than women, inflated each rubber, sealed the end, and placed it on a slow-moving conveyor belt. Any that deflated while traveling across the room fell through a gap in the belt and were swept up and discarded at the end of the day. No seconds for the Europeans. Although consumers had been advised for centuries to use the blow up test themselves, most men did not bother. Others tried to fill their condoms with water to test for holes, but this caused the talcum on them to get sticky, which tended to fill any holes, making it impossible to know if they were flawed or not, and left them looking like a lump of gray bread dough. And for all the variety of test methods, it was revealed at the end of the 30s that only about 25% of all condoms were exposed to any sort of trial in the factory or at home. Send me some samples. The incredible success of the condom industry had its downside. Its high visibility brought attention to its defects. A biochemist conducting research in 1935 made his findings widely available to the media and to government officials. Cecil Rugg and his research team tested 2,000 sheaths, which his assistants purchased from a wide variety of retail outlets around the United States. Blowing up and filling with water every single one of them, Vogue found that almost 60% of the rubbers were substandard, proving that either there was a little testing going on or the existing methods were inadequate. Since the industrialists were honest in saying that they only tested 25%, the numbers were not surprising, and the reluctance on the part of makers to spend the money to test all of their products is not surprising either. Even though labor was cheap, the process slowed the product's journey to market and did add to the cost of production, something that was more significant to the little guys than the major players in the industry. Youngs could afford to do a pretty good job testing his top brands. Trojans because they fetched premium prices, but he also sold his to duds. But he also sold his duds to others. Because of Rogue's very public findings and the fact that the business was so big, it stuck out as a rare example of success in a time of so much failure. In 1937, the Food and Drug Administration decided it was time to get involved in the testing of rubbers. Ignoring the newly legal birth control status of the condom, officials at the FDA decided they could open the doors of the condom producers to the watchful gaze of federal agents by pouncing on its role as disease preventative. The clever administrators declared sheaths were now a drug. In many ways, the FDA's creativity did have a positive effect on the condom market. Determined to remain ahead of the pack with his Trojan brand, which sold more than 30 million in 1930 alone, Young's was the first to react, and he went so far as to fund the invention of the first genuine technology for advanced testing of each condom manufactured by Young's Rubber. It was actually the brainchild and inspired by the European method of testing of Young's brother, who patented his condom testing conveyor belt in 1940, but it was in use at Young's plant by 1938. In his 1939 description of the new machine, author Youngs explained how, after each had been taken from the production conveyor belt, the article was placed open and up on a small frame, and automated holes filled it with water. Since the water would come out of any tiny hole or perforation and was clearly visible to the human eye, defective articles were easy to spot and were removed manually. This eventually proves to be a boon to the big manufacturers of rubbers, saving them a fortune in testing by speeding up the process, cutting down on the number of workers needed for flipping, hipping, or cheeking, and improving the quality tenfold. It also meant that the latex variety had to be finished off without that delicate little dusting of talcum powder. The FDA's consumer sensitive regulations had a resounding effect upon the booming industry. For the big boys, it meant a small bite into their profits, but it also pushed them into continued modernity and further market consolidation. To the last of the smaller companies, it was the beginning of the end, but it was not the end of federal fiddling. Defective drugs, as if it could get any worse for the smaller manufacturers. Congress unintentionally signed their death warrant when it passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, a bill intended to update and expand the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. The new bill, which went into effect in 1940, did not actually mention the condom by name. Rather, it stated that all drug manufacturers had to guarantee their products to be defect free. Packaging had to include accurate labeling that informed the consumer about who had made the product and where it had been produced, and no incorrect or misleading information could be printed on the package. Before the new legislation, the FDA had the right to keep track of condom testing, but there were no legal mechanisms to ensure that every one of the millions sold per year had been tested or to punish abusers if caught. Although Schmidt and Youngs chose to follow the letter to the law, others had not. Condom as drug changed all that. Immediately after the passage of the bill, the FDA wasted no time. FDA officials had seized more than 6,000 gross defective articles within a month and were confiscating rubbers at an astounding rate. The lawmakers had given the feds a powerful tool to enforce the regulations. Not only could they seize any and all crates they knew or assumed were defective, but federal agents also had the power to levy fines against abusers. The law allowed up to $10,000 per seizure. If that was not enough, the federal government could imprison for up to 3 years anyone who was caught more than once for involvement in the production, transport, or sales of defective items. Thanks to their use of trademarks and commitment to testing, Schmidt Inc. and Young's Rubber, both at the top of the heap all along, were the only companies still making legally produced condoms by 1941. Trojans, Sheiks, and Ramses were now the most popular brands in America. They even got the Consumer Union's seal of approval. Sadly, the law said nothing about condoms made for export. Even though he had finally seen the error of his ways at home, Young's continued to sell his seconds overseas. This was also the only legitimate market left for a few of the smaller companies who could not meet FDA standards but continued to produce for export. Admissibility of contraceptive defects. The Tariff Act of 1930. Like so much of the history of the condom, it is difficult to reconcile practice with law. By the 1930s, there were still lingering leftovers from the Comstock Act, principally because it had never actually been overturned by Congress, but rather individual court actions had slowly picked away at its impact. One of the remaining leftovers was that birth control could only be sold for medicinal purposes. Women's diaphragms were for prevention of dangerous pregnancies, and condoms were for protection against disease. This remaining law clashed directly with the Court of Appeals decision. in 1936 to allow the advertising of sheaths as birth control, not to speak of the open and legal advertising now so common. In shades of Comstock, however, some overzealous federal agents fell back on it in order to prosecute and persecute an unsuspecting individual. Customs agents claiming they took the imports for the purpose of determining their usefulness for contraceptive purposes, confiscated a large order of pessaries imported from Japan by an American doctor. The District Court for the United States dismissed the suit, declaring that although the statute prohibited all persons from importing any article whatever for the prevention of contraception, the pessaries were for proper medical use. The judge went on to declare that as long as birth control items were not imported or sold for immoral reasons, contraceptives may be manufactured and sold and sent through the mails. A legal expert of the time declared that the Comstock Act had been almost emasculated by judicial nullification. In spite of its contribution of one more nail into the coffin of leftover Comstockery, this case illustrates again the strange intersections of morality, the law, the marketplace, and individual choice. Condoms had been used forever for birth control, and it was perfectly legal to sell them as such. Even the military had been promoting them as both disease preventative and birth control officially. But when preventatives came into the legal spotlight again, the same old morality clause regarding purpose of use was trotted out of the closet. Once again, logic and common sense seem to have been absent in the courtroom. As for the condom industrialists, they had just smiled and got on with business. The spiritual device, in recognition of the financial reasons to limit family size. In 1931, even the conservative Federal Council of Churches endorsed birth control for married couples, while at the same time admitting that by doing so, they might be giving the green light for people to indulge in illicit sex. In a similar move across the pond in 1930, the Lambert Conference of Bishops of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, reversed its 1920 condemnation of birth control and officially sanctioned its use. Church officials stated that using devices was okay, where there is a clearly felt moral obligation to limit or avoid parenthood. Dissenters were horrified at the radical move, fearful artificial means would lead to having sex anytime, anywhere, which would in turn lead to selfishness. But the Church of England's leaders showed a very practical side and did not back down from their decision. Infuriated by such a sinful reversal from the English Church's negative stance on artificial birth control 10 years prior, the Catholic Church officially entered for the first time the public debate over contraception. Pope Pius XI issued his encyclical Casti Connubii only a few months after the Lambeth Conference. Since therefore openly departing from the uninterrupted Christian tradition, some recently have judged it possible solemnly to declare another doctrine regarding this question. The Catholic Church, to whom God has entrusted the defense of the integrity and purity of morals, standing erect in the midst of the moral ruin which surrounds her, in order that she may preserve the chastity of the nuptial union from being defiled by this foul stain, raises her voice in token of her divine ambassadorship, and though our mouth proclaims anew any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature. And those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin. Although the church had long since against contraception, although the church had long been against contraception, this is the first time an official statement made it clear that Catholics were not to use anything that would prevent them from standing erect in the midst of moral ruin. An interesting turn of phrase given the subject. This stance was to set the stage for church doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st, since no pope has ever reversed this anti condom, anti birth control statement. The warring church doctrines illuminate a new and very serious schism within the Christian community, and the divide would just get bigger throughout the century as Catholic doctrine did not mesh with the needs and often the practice of its flock, while more liberal churches like the Anglican began during the Depression to seek ways to help alleviate human suffering by being practical when it came to its parishioners, few of whom could afford big families and too many mouths to feed. This new struggle would have to wait, however, as the next chapter in the history of the condom was about to begin, and in spite of his hatred of the device, it was Herr who wrote it.